Hello, glad you're back with us again. We're in Daniel chapter 3 today. We've introduced the book. We've examined chapter 1. Daniel has been in Nebuchadnezzar's court. And then in chapter 2, he basically interprets, after giving the dream, he interprets the dream for Nebuchadnezzar. And he's had some interactions then with the king. In Daniel chapter 3, we have an interesting text because Daniel's not in it. It's his three buddies that we've been acquainted with a little bit now in chapters 1 and 2, and their names are Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is their, I suppose, more commonly known. Those are their Babylonian names, and we've said that a number of times. These fellas here, we're going to see in chapter 3, really go into a test. And just as an introductory point, it's interesting that some of these other versions date this as to being the 18th year of King Nebuchadnezzar. That would put it around somewhere around 586 BC. Don't know if that's quite true or not. Some of these versions have this other little snippet in there. I can't quite say if that's true or not, but nonetheless, it's something worth observing. And Jeremiah 52 talks about the siege, and verse 29 has a little bit of a notation about that. Jeremiah 52 29. Maybe that's where it got incorporated from. Why is Daniel not present? I'm not quite sure. Could have been that he was on business. Later on in chapter 8, we're going to find out that he was in the, what does it say? The palace at the citadel of Susa in the province of Elam. He looks in the vision and he says he was beside the Ulai Canal. I wonder if that's in the vision, or I wonder if that's where he actually is personally. Tough to say if that's just a visionary thing or if he's actually there. And tomorrow I may tell you different from what I tell you today on what my thought is on 8, 1, and 2, where Daniel was. Whether it was just visionary or whether he was actually there. Tough to say. Maybe he was on a business trip there. Maybe he's on a business trip here in chapter 3. Don't know where he is, but whatever the case, it's not a major issue. It's not a major issue. And it's interesting that if we have a late authorship, as we've talked about a little bit at length, if we have a late author, I don't think they would leave Daniel out of this story if all of this is just some fictitious writing. Daniel would be here in the text if a late writer were drawing all of this up fictitiously, don't you think? I certainly do. Okay, so let's see if we can't make some sense of what's going on here. In chapter 3, it says this. Let's read through about verse 7. Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold, the height of which was 60 cubits, and its width 6 cubits. He set it upon the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. And then Nebuchadnezzar the king sent word to assemble the satraps, the prefects, the governors, counselors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, all the rulers of the provinces, to come to the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. This is 3:3. Then the satraps, the prefects, governors, counselors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, rulers of the provinces were assembled for the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And then the herald loudly proclaimed, "To you the command is given, O peoples, nations, and men of every language, that at the moment you hear the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, bagpipe, and all kinds of music, you are to fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king has set up." I'll say something about that here in just a moment. It says in verse 6, verse 6 of Daniel, "But whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into the midst of a furnace of blazing fire." It says in verse 7, "Therefore at that time when all the peoples heard the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, bagpipe, and all kinds of music, all the peoples, nations, and men of every language fell down and worshipped the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up." So you get the idea. The music is supposed to play, the people are supposed to bow down and worship this golden image that Nebuchadnezzar had made, which is something around, it looks like 90 feet. So says verse 1. The cubit is something like 18 inches. So 1.5 feet. So you've got a cubit is about 1.5 feet. So you've got something like 90 feet, and its width, the height is 90 feet, and the width is something like 9 feet. So it's a rather large deal. But this isn't out of place. I read one skeptic who talked about whether or not this was even possible. Of course it's possible. I mean, think about some of the wonders of the world. I mean, just give yourself a quick glance over some of these towers, the Leaning Tower of Pisa. Give yourself a thought about some of these other structures. completely possible. It's completely possible. And then there was a question about the gold. A casual glance at the reading of the Old Testament, consistently Babylon is associated with being a nation who had great wealth and gold. And of course, if you look at 2 Kings 24 and 25, they raided Solomon's temple. Wonder where all that gold went. Then you've got Daniel chapter 3 here, and it says in verse 5, there are 3 Greek words: lyre, psaltery, and bagpipe, as I've got it translated here in the NASB. Lyre, psaltery, and bagpipe. It uses those words, Greek words, in 3:5, 3:7, and 3:10. I think that's all of them, as far as I remember. 3:5, 3:7, and 3:10. 3 times in this chapter, it uses 3 Greek words. S.R. Driver, an Old Testament scholar, who was really pivotal in bringing naturalism into our schools of theology. S.R. Driver once argued that the fact that there are Greek words in the text of Daniel forces the conclusion that this has to be written by a late author after Greek had become a major language, after Alexander's day. That's very interesting to me, seeing that the only 3 words that we have in Daniel's text are musical words and could easily be loan words that had slipped into the Greek language because they were prior used in another language. This doesn't look like it's something that is predominantly Greek, don't you think? I mean, if it were written in Antiochus's day, 175 BC, don't you think that we'd have more of a Greek text than we do Hebrew and Aramaic? Why would the text not be in Greek at all? In fact, we've got 3 Greek words. It's very odd to me, if we have a late author, that this text is actually in the Hebrew and Aramaic that it is. And even the Aramaic style, the professionals tell us, matches that of the Elephantine papyri, which says something about the earliness of even the style of the Aramaic. I find that interesting, don't you? It says something once again, about a 6th century authorship and how favorable that view is over against the other view, which is that it's a 2nd century fictitious author. I'm telling you, the only real reason, if these folks were honest about it, that they even believe in such a thing is because they're embedded with naturalism and they want to give up on miraculous predictive prophecy. That is the driving force. The minute you accept God as being a supernatural being and he can step into a system that we had once thought to be closed, but he's not restricted by those laws, the minute we accept that kind of conclusion, God can certainly do this sort of thing and work in the lives of people like Daniel. Not a problem at all to have a 6th century authorship. This is chapter 3 then, and verse 6. This command is that the person should be, if they don't listen to Nebuchadnezzar's decree to bow down to the golden image, he says, cast them into the midst of the blazing fire, the furnace of fire. Well, Nebuchadnezzar had done this sort of thing before. This is Jeremiah chapter 29. This is Jeremiah chapter 29 and verse 22. Let me give you another text here. This is Jeremiah 29:22. It says this, because of them a curse will be used by all the exiles from Judah who are in Babylon, saying, catch this, may the Lord make you like Zedekiah and like Ahab, whom the king of Babylon roasted in the fire. We've got 2 other fellas, Ahab and Zedekiah, who had been roasted in the fire by King Nebuchadnezzar. So this was nothing uncommon. Anybody who would think otherwise and say, well, this just wasn't the common style of the day, Jeremiah kind of attests to this as being a reality. And even the liberal critical scholars accept that Jeremiah is rather early. Let me say that again. They accept, like Ezekiel, that Jeremiah is early. So Daniel and this story here in chapter 3 is quite in line with even earlier accounts. Maybe it's authentic. This is 3:8. So for this reason, at that time, certain of the Chaldeans came forward, 3:8, and brought charges against the Jews. This is an idiom meaning slander. They were coming about in a slanderous, gossipy kind of way, not for good purpose. They have an agenda. And it says in 3:9, they responded and said to Nebuchadnezzar the king, O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that every man who hears the sound of the horn, flute, here's these Greek words again, lyre, trigon, psaltery, and bagpipe, and all kinds of music, is to fall down and worship the golden image. But, verse 11, whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into the midst of a furnace of blazing fire. Now in verse 12 it says this, there are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the administration of the province of Babylon, specifically, namely, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have disregarded you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image which you have set up. So, upon hearing this sort of thing, verse 13 says, Daniel 3:13 says, then Nebuchadnezzar in rage and anger gave orders to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Then these men were brought before the king. Nebuchadnezzar responded and said to them, verse 14, is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up? Well, he keeps going, and he says this in 15. Now, if you are ready, at the moment you hear the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, and bagpipe, oh, there are those words again, 3:15, I forgot that one, and all kinds of music, to fall down and worship the image that I have made, very well. But if you do not worship, you will immediately be cast into the midst of a furnace of blazing fire. And he asks this question, here's a good one. What God is there who can deliver you out of my hands? It's almost as if Nebuchadnezzar gets this idea, hey, these fellas, I've worked with them before, no worries. And he almost says something like, we'll do it again. We'll run the music again, and next time when the cue is, you just go ahead, and if you'll just bow down for us, that'll be good. And he says, but I will say this, if you don't do it this time, you better have somebody who can deliver you. There's not a God like you, that can deliver you out of my hands. Well, Nebuchadnezzar is making a little bit of an assumption, don't you think? In fact, Pharaoh had asked something like that of Moses, didn't he? This is Exodus 5:1-2. Pharaoh had said something like this. Who is the God? Who is this God that's commanding that I let your people go? Who is your God, is the question he asks. He asked a good question. Moses, a teacher led by God, decided he'd give him a 10-lesson course on exactly who God was. Took him all the way from the frogs and the water turned to blood, all the way up to the death of the firstborn. By the end of all that, Pharaoh knew who God was. Nebuchadnezzar says this, who is that God? What God is there who can deliver you out of my hands? Well, Nebuchadnezzar, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego might just take you up on your challenge and demonstrate who it is that this God is. His name is Yahweh. He's the God of Israel. He's the one who split the sea. He's the creator of heavens and earth. And you have made the assumption that there's not a God that exists with that kind of power. Nebuchadnezzar, where do you think you came from? The God of heaven created you. And Nebuchadnezzar still got issues with his pride, as we'll see not only at the end of this chapter, but even into chapter 4. Now take a look at this then. In 16, Daniel 3:16, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to give you an answer concerning this matter. Look, we don't answer to you, Mr. King. That's fine. That's fine that you've got your little agenda. But this is again one of those cases where we as Christians need to learn that while the naturalistic worldview has its agenda and they ascribe status based on their own views, we don't need their approval. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are a wonderful testament to those of us who are in the Christian faith to demonstrate we don't need approval from the world. And so in Daniel 3 and verse 17, they say, if it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But they're also realistic. God has let his servants die before, hasn't he? He's let his servants suffer. Why? Even to go a step further, there are cases like in Job 42:11, 2 Corinthians 12, where God himself is even the one responsible for it. Let's not make the mistake of thinking that God wasn't responsible for putting Jesus on the tree. He was Jesus in the flesh. Jesus was God in the flesh, and he knew that it was in his power to go to the tree. Why do you think God lets the righteous suffer? Psalm 22. Psalm 22 talks about the righteous sufferer as the psalmist presents it, and that expands itself into Jesus' own experience and even into ours, those of us who are righteous and suffer for the righteous cause. Why do you think it is that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego might just not make it out of this fire? Don't know. Don't know exactly why. But I'll tell you this, evil, pain, and suffering, it's the senselessness of it that makes us feel maybe God does have a sense to why it's there. And the biblical text has something to say about that. I think I told you about my little book, Substantive Faith. It deals with the problem of evil, pain, and suffering in a couple of pages. Maybe offer some good thoughts as to why God allows it to go on. Gives us a number of reasons why it takes place in our world. It calls attention to sin. It calls attention to our inability to deliver ourselves. It calls our attention to God when perhaps we wouldn't have thrown our attention at God if everything were just going down the path that we had described to ourselves. There is a purpose to evil, pain, and suffering, but sometimes God delivers because that's his purpose, and he sees a better thing coming out of it there. This is Daniel 3 and verse 17. God will deliver us. That's what they say. They go another step. This is 3:18. But even if he does not, let it be known to you, O king, that we're not going to serve your gods or worship the golden image that you've set up. Not unlike Daniel, these fellows have purposed in their heart that they are going to not defile themselves with the king's meat or the king's wine. Here, they're not going to defile themselves by bowing down to this polytheistic style of an image. And so they had made up their minds, and they're telling us to do the same. In Daniel 3 and verse 18, even if all of the crises and the circumstances come against us as God's people, we'll still serve him. He is Lord of heaven and earth, and he demands, and it's not a demand because he hates us, it's a demand for our own good, that he loves us. And he says, serve me. And in the end of it all, God's giving us a crown of life that's far surpassing than anything we've got here. Maybe James 1:12 says something about that. Now let's get this passage. This is Isaiah chapter 43 and verse 2. This is Isaiah 43:2. Listen to what this older prophet, a few years before Daniel, had to say about the time after the exile. Or it says something about God's character even during exile. But it says this in 43:2. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you. This is God's assurance that he is actually with his people, with Israel. And he says, and through the rivers, they will not overflow you. And then listen to this line. When you walk through the fire, you will not be scorched, nor will the flame burn you. I wonder if that had some kind of impact on Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I wonder if they knew the prophets. I wonder if they knew Isaiah. And I wonder if they knew that text and knew God was with them. I don't think it's a literal prediction of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, you understand. But I do think that these were the kinds of lines that they knew and drew upon. And they knew that this God, the Creator God that they served, Jehovah, Yahweh, they knew this God had the power to deliver. But even if he wouldn't, they'd still serve him. This is Psalm 66 then. And check this one out. This is Psalm 66 and verse 12. It says this in a context where the psalmist is praising God for his abilities and his wonderful works. It says this in Psalm 66:12. You made men ride over our heads. We went through fire and through water, yet you brought us out into a place of abundance. Now, that's all good. Those are Old Testament texts that maybe these individuals knew. Can't quite say for sure, but there's a New Testament text that calls our attention to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in another way. This is Hebrews 11, written long after Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's day, that says this, and what more shall I say? This is 11:32 of Hebrews. Time will fail me if I tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, the prophets, who by faith conquered kingdoms, performed acts of righteousness, obtained promises. Here's a line about Daniel's text. Shut the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, from weakness were made strong, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. He says, I'm out of time, the Hebrew writer says. And he says, but I could also tell you about, and he lists a number of people. He doesn't name them explicitly, but Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego find their names implicitly all over Daniel 11:32 through 34. That's the kind of faith that you and I need to have. It's the kind of unwavering faith that says we know our God, we know his power, and even if the world collides around us, we'll still serve him. This is Daniel 3:19. Then Nebuchadnezzar was filled with wrath. You can imagine, here's the man who thinks he's boss of earth, boss of heaven and earth. And he's just had three little eunuch boys that he's had in his court for a number of years now. He's just had them say, we think we'll pass on your offer. We'd rather die. Oh my. Of course he's filled with wrath. And his facial expression was altered toward Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He answered by giving orders to heat the furnace 7 times more. That's an Aramaic idiom meaning as hot as possible. That it was usually heated. Then it was usually heated. Verse 20 says, he commanded certain valiant warriors who were in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in order to cast them into the furnace of blazing fire. Then these men were tied up in their trousers, coats, caps, their other clothes, and they were cast into the midst of the furnace of blazing fire. Now catch this in 322. And for this reason, because the king's command was urgent and the furnace had been made extremely hot, the flame of the fire slew those men who carried up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So surely you'd think that once these fellas get cast into it, they'd be, extinguished. This is verse 23. But these three men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell into the midst of the furnace of blazing fire, still tied up. And then in verse 24, Nebuchadnezzar the king was astounded, stood up in haste. He said this to his high officials, "Was it not three men we cast bound into the midst of the fire?" And they replied to the king, "Certainly, O king." And he says in 25, "Look, I see four men loosed and walking about in the midst of the fire without harm, and the appearance of the fourth is like a son of the gods." Okay, let's spend just a moment here. I've seen the NIV criticized by a number of well-intentioned fellas, good-intentioned fellas, and they have criticized the NIV based on the fact that it says something like "son of the gods." And they say, this is why we reject the NIV. It reduces the divinity of Christ. Well, the NIV may have its problems, and does have its problems. That's a point that needs discussion, I'd say. But this isn't one of them. The Aramaic term is in the plural. The literal translation here would read as gods. Literally then, the appearance of the fourth figure in the fire is like a son of the gods. So it is in the plural. The original text has it in the plural. So let's stop criticizing the translation on a poor argument, to say the least. If you've got criticisms against the version, by all means make the criticism. But if it's not a just one, then don't make it. I mean, you got to do your research before you just criticize. And so this is Daniel 3:25, and we need to think about this then. Is there any hint there that this is Jesus Christ? I know a number of scholars who think that it is the second member of the Godhead, Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus the Christ. But is there really support for that? And furthermore, I think we need to consider who's the one saying this. Who is the one saying in 25, I see that there are four men loosed walking about in the midst of the fire. The appearance of the fourth fella is like the son of the gods. Well, it's Nebuchadnezzar, isn't it? I wonder what he thought when he thought of, quote-unquote, gods. Is he thinking of God like you and I think of God if we're Christian? I don't think so. I think Nebuchadnezzar is thinking in his own polytheistic understanding. And then there's one more thing to note, and that's in 328. Nebuchadnezzar says this in 328. He responded and said, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants who put their trust in him." I think it's a stretch at least. Now maybe, let's say this. Is it possible that it was the second member of the Godhead? I think it's a possibility. I'm not keen on the view, but I'll tell you this, there's no textual support here for that conclusion. I think it's a stretch, at least from this text, to say that it is the second member of the Godhead, Jesus Christ. I just don't see that. It's not there. And all of the evidence that people appeal to is in the mouth of Nebuchadnezzar, a polytheist who then later, even in 328, calls him the angel, and you've got the word in the Aramaic in the plural, son of the gods. So you've got problems at least establishing the view that it was the second member of the Godhead if it's in this text. You've at least got difficulties there. There's a question that needs some examination, and it's about whether or not Jesus Christ is in the Old Testament. You'll do your own homework on that. Not dealing with that right now. This isn't the place, I don't think. Daniel 3, who is it? Maybe it is Jesus Christ. But if so, the text is just not saying that. Maybe it's just an angel. Maybe it's just God's messenger, his angel, that he sent into the fire to deliver them. Tough to say, but in Daniel chapter 6, where Daniel's in the lion's den, we've got a similar kind of thing. At least it's a similar kind of thing. And it says in chapter 6, Daniel spoke to the king, 6:21. This is when Darius comes to the pit. Daniel is there. Daniel's been delivered through the night. And it says in 6:21, Daniel spoke to the king, "O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they've not harmed me." That's not to say that it couldn't be a different figure than is talked about in Daniel 3. But Daniel chapter 6 has Daniel, a righteous fellow, not a polytheist, saying God sent his angel. Here we've only got the remarks of Nebuchadnezzar, a polytheist, and he says in 325, the appearance of the fourth is like a son of the gods, plural. Maybe it's just an angel. And Daniel 6:22 maybe even shed some light on that. God sent an angel just like he did for Daniel. He sends one now for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Maybe that's the right thing to take. This is 326. So Nebuchadnezzar came near to the door of the furnace of blazing fire. He responded and said, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, come out, you servants of the Most High God, and come here. Odd that all of a sudden he calls the Most High God the Most High God. Well, he had asked them, hadn't he? This was 315. What God is there who can deliver you out of my hands? He knows now. There is somebody who can deliver. How strange, how strange. Whatever God this was that was doing the delivering, Nebuchadnezzar didn't know him, and he just found out. This is 326. Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the midst of the fire. This is the God who can deliver folks from fire. And it says in verse 27, the satraps, prefects, governors, kings' high officials gathered around and saw in regard to these men that the fire had no effect. Isn't that something? On the bodies of these men, nor was the hair of their head even singed, nor were their trousers damaged, nor had the smell of fire even come upon them. This is the king's number one instrument to fight against God. And the text says in 327, fire had no effect. 328, Nebuchadnezzar responded and said, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants who put their trust in him, violating the king's command. But like Peter in Acts 5:29, they knew we ought to obey God rather than men, and yielded up their bodies, 328, so as not to serve or worship any god except their own God. Make sure your loyalty is with your God first. Everything else, if you are truly loyal to your God, will fall into place. Make sure your loyalty is to God first. Everything else will fall into place. Verse 29, Therefore I make a decree that any people, nation, or tongue that speaks anything offensive against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, and their houses reduced to a rubbish heap, inasmuch as there is no other God who is able to deliver in this way. Then the king caused Shadrach, verse 30, Meshach, and Abednego to prosper in the province of Babylon. Well, not quite sure, given what chapter 4 is going to tell us, that Nebuchadnezzar's a real faithful fellow at this point. But you can only imagine, here he just watched these three men and then sees a fourth fellow who jumps into the fire and we don't even know where he came from. He's just seen three men spared by a 7 times hotter fiery furnace. And then a fourth fellow appears. Of course, Nebuchadnezzar is going to make a decree saying that he supports the God that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego support. But does that mean he's got faith? Maybe not at this point. Maybe he's still timid. Maybe he's just a little bit afraid. But at this point, I don't think we've seen anything like faith generated in Nebuchadnezzar. What we do see in Daniel chapter 3 is there's extreme faith on the part of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And that's the kind of faith that Daniel's text is wanting us to see and have. He's wanting us not only to see it, he's wanting us to embellish and develop our own faith just like these men had. You still have questions, comments? Hey, drop me a line, drewleonard@live.com. Have other questions about Daniel chapter 3, maybe a little more academic? Hey, grab a copy of the book. It might help you. It's got a wealth of material here that we're just not talking about even in this video series. Thanks for joining us. Hopefully next time you'll enjoy our study of Daniel chapter 4. God bless you as you continue to work always to His glory.